that there are still some issues with understanding how the router works in a template and how these different Vue files work, I thought of recording a quick introduction that basically goes step by step through these things. So I've created 4 different HTML documents and I've uploaded them on Ping Pong as well. And they basically increasingly move things to components. And then in the last example, we exchange components. So if you look at the very first example, we have an HTML file that has the Bootstrap import, and it has also the Vue.js import. And then it has, similar to the template that we uploaded, it has this Jumbotron box with 2 navigation links. So I added one link to // and one to //second comp, so for second component. And then I have a row with 3 columns, and in the middle one I basically have 2 interpolations. So I have a title that I want to display and a description, and then at the very end I have a footer basically. And compared to the basic examples in the lecture, the only thing I did here is that I moved all the JavaScript to a separate file. So if you go to one app.js, you will see that this looks very familiar to the code that I've shown in the lecture, that we create a new Vue instance, we mount it to an element in our HTML tree, and we have some data, in this case the title and the description that we want to display. So if you want to run this, you can just execute the HTML, and you will see that it shows the box, it shows the navigation links. The links don't do anything right now apart from changing the reference, the URL up there. But the title and the description that I inserted, they work. So this works, and this is all fine. But at some point you will get a lot of code and you want to move things into components to modularize your application. So this is the second example I did here. Essentially the HTML is very similar, so I still have both imports. I still have a JS file I reference. The only difference is that here in the middle I don't have my interpolations, but instead I have a tag that is called home-comp. And this is now a component that I have defined. So if we look into the JavaScript file, you will see that I have this view.component, and here is the definition. So it's called home-comp. And it has data, so it has my title and my description that before I had in the Vue instance. Now I've moved this to the component. And it also has a template, so some kind of HTML code in a string that is basically the same as before. It's a div that contains a header with my title, and it contains a description. And again, if we run this, you won't see a difference. So this looks exactly the same. The only thing is now that under the hood in my Vue code, this is a component. And the direct benefit I have of this is that I can reuse it. So I can just add another home component, let's say here, and it should display double the text. So now the same component is also here. So now you can have reuse, that's already quite nice. Now the third step, I'll just undo this. The third step basically introduces the Vue files. And now things change a little bit. If we go into the HTML file, it's still not so different. One thing you might notice is that I removed the Vue dependency up here. And the reason is that I'll build this with my build step later on. The other thing is that here I've exchanged my component, so it doesn't say home-comp. I've exchanged for a div with ID mount point. So this is again where Vue will dynamically insert something. And then I reference my JavaScript file, and this time I don't reference my 03_app, but I actually reference something that I call app build. So this shows you the name indicates that I actually have to do some build step in between. And this is always the case when you want to use files that end on .vue, because JavaScript, regular JavaScript, doesn't know how to handle this. And the other thing that's new in my JS file is that I actually use these require statements. And again, using those things requires some kind of pre-processing that JavaScript understands this. So what I do here is actually, this is corresponding to importing my Vue dependency. So before that I had it in an HTML tag, now I just do it in the JavaScript code. And I import a Vue component, and we'll look at that very soon. And then all I do in the actual Vue instance is that, again, I say mount my application at the element with ID mount point. And then whenever the rendering is done, so whenever the HTML tree is finished, create the element home component. So basically, it means that I load my application, and then at this position in the code, I will simply insert my component. So looking into the HTML code, here later on, I will insert my component. Now, if we look into the Vue file that I require, here it is, you will see that this is again the same as before. I have a div, I have a header, a paragraph, and I have two interpolations. And in the script part, it looks a bit different. I have this export and I have a name, which just has to be unique, but it doesn't, otherwise there's no requirement here. And again, it has data, looking slightly different, but it's the same thing. So again, I have a title and a description. And now, as I said, I have to build this. So this is what in your template is done whenever you do npm install. Here I have instead created my own command. So I just call the command build comp. And it runs browserify and vueify, which basically convert my JavaScript into a real JavaScript that the browser understands. So I just do this. If I go here and I do npm run build comp, it will execute this command. And it will basically, from my 03_app, it will create an 03_app build, which is the file that I reference here in my HTML. And now if I load it, it will again look exactly the same as before. So now basically I've shown three different versions that look the same but do very different things in the back. So this one just has everything in one file more or less. This one has a specific component defined. And here we have the same component, but I've moved the component to a separate file. And this is mainly for structuring things. And also in my component, I get proper syntax highlighting here. I can do new lines and so on. Whereas if you look into the component here, I have to define all the HTML in a single string, and that's not very comfortable. The other good thing is it's a separate file. So if I have multiple JavaScript files, I can actually reference this and I don't have to copy the code. I can reference this and include the same component in different applications. Okay, so those are the first three steps, and they are, I'll just show a couple of slides that more or less explain how they work to maybe visualize this. So the first one, the 01 plain.html basically has all the HTML code plus two interpolations in the HTML file, and then has an include to a JavaScript. And this means that the JavaScript that actually has my Vue instance and all the data is referenced here, and it will resolve these two interpolations and add the text at runtime. In the second case, I still have most of my HTML code, but I inserted these home-comp tags in the middle. And in my JavaScript file, I basically defined the component with this name. And in this case, I moved all the data there, and I defined what kind of HTML to insert. So now my interpolations have moved here, but otherwise it's still the same. And then finally, in the third one, I went back to my div with a specific ID. And my JavaScript file should insert everything at this position. And the JavaScript file in turn has a reference to a Vue file, which later on, as soon as the HTML page is ready, is created. And this Vue file basically has my data, and it has also the interpolations, my header and my paragraph. So this is what is happening here. Now, these are components. And then the third and the final case is the router. And the router assumes that you have understood how these components work, that you can insert them and so on. And if you go into the HTML, I haven't changed anything here. So this is exactly the same as the third version. I have a div with mount point, and I refer to a 04 build.javascript. So this one we can forget. There's nothing new here. But if we look into the JavaScript file, it looks a bit different. So I still have my dependency to Vue, but I've also added a dependency to the Vue router, and I've told the Vue application to actually use this router. Then let's ignore this for now. But then I have, this is similar to earlier. I basically import a component that's in router-comp.view with this name. And as soon as the HTML page is ready, I say create this. So this is exactly the same as before. Now the only difference is if you look into this router component, it has almost nothing. The only thing it has this router-view tag. And this is a specific tag that is defined by Vue, by the Vue router library. And basically it means that depending on the kind of component you select in your router, that component will be taken and put into this router view tag. And this is the only difference here. So what I'm now doing is I define a view router, and I give this router two routes. I basically say there is a path slash and there's one slash second comp. And depending on this path, please take either the home component or the second component. So basically what I do now is I take everything that's in here, insert it into my mount point element, and then depending on the path, the router goes in, selects any of these two components, and puts it into the router view tags. So the reason why this now I have to build it first. So this now is here. This looks the same as before, but now I've added a path here. So if I click on second link, up here my link changes and the router understands that slash second comp is a reference to my second component. So it basically takes the second component, puts it in here. If I change it again, it changes it back. So this is just depending on the URL up here. And if I change it to anything else, it won't know what to do because that's not defined. So it only knows about the slash route and it knows about the second link route. So in order to make that work, the only thing is in my HTML document, I actually have to define those references. So I have the slash and I have the slash second comp reference. So this is essentially using components, inserting components at runtime, and then using the router to exchange the components depending on the path. And again, I have a slide that shows how this works in practice, or more or less. I again have my mount point div. I reference a script, should actually be 04. No, here we are. Okay, I have my router, I have a div, and I have my JavaScript. The JavaScript has a view router with two different paths and a router component. So it references this router component which has these two tags. And then depending on the path, if it's slash or slash second comp, it uses either of the other two components and takes the code that is in the template and puts it in here into the router view. So this is how the whole thing works. And I recommend to go through these files. I have them uploaded on the on Gül. And in case you haven't understood how this works, just go step by step and try to play around with it and see how it works. Because that's the only way you'll understand how this really works.